Well, good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, and welcome to our webinar today. My name is Wafa El Sadr, and I'm the Global Director for ICAP at Columbia University. And I welcome you warmly for our webinar today that's entitled Informing Cancer Equity with Globally Diverse Data. Just to tell you a little bit about this webinar series, is co-sponsored by ICAP at Columbia University and also as well by the Herbert Irving Comprehensive Cancer Center at Columbia University. And this initiative aims to enable focus on issues that relate in particular to efforts to advance the training, research, as well as programmatic activities that relate to cancer diagnosis, prevention, and management in low and middle income countries. It's been a wonderful collaboration between ICAP and the Cancer Center under the leadership of Dr. Anil Rustigui. Now I'm going to present very briefly our speaker today, and then we'll follow by a presentation by Dr. Timothy Rebbeck, and then by a questions and answers and discussion period. I encourage you all to please put your questions anytime during the presentation in the Q&A box. And then use the chat box to indicate your name and your organizational affiliation. We always do record these webinars, and the slides and the recording will be posted on the ICAP website at Columbia University. So let me get started by sharing with you a brief introduction of Dr. Timothy Rebbeck. He is the Vincent L. Gregory Professor of Cancer Prevention at the Harvard T.H. Chan School of Public Health and Dana-Farber Cancer Institute. His studies have focused on the etiology and prevention of cancer with an emphasis on cancer disparities and global health in particular. He's directed several large multi-center studies, international consortia that are focused on identifying genetic, molecular, and epidemiological factors associated with cancer risk, outcomes, and disparities. He leads a large network, which is called the International Men of African Descent and Carcinoma of the Prostate Network, and he's led several other consortia that study hereditary cancer risk and prevention. He's also been an advocate for addressing cancer and cancer equity, and has been very active in terms of also a focus on global cancer-related issues around the world. Without further ado, I invite you, Dr. Rebbeck, to please share with us your presentation, and we'll take questions and engage you in a discussion after you complete your presentation. Thank you again, and welcome everyone.
Thank you very much for that introduction, Dr. Al Sadr, and I'm really pleased to be here today to talk to you a little bit about some of the work that we've been doing and some thoughts about global cancer from the perspective of someone who's been working in the field for about 20 years now. Can you see my slides? Everything okay?
Yes.
Great. So I'm going to give you a little bit of overview about why we think about cancer in Africa as an example, and I'll use prostate cancer because it's my major focus, just to give you a sense of the kinds of things that we can think about when we want to develop research, clinical, and training activities in low and middle income countries. And I'll use this as an example, but I think you can probably globally search and replace cancer and prostate cancer for many other diseases and disorders because some of these principles, I think, are relevant across the board. So why should we focus on cancer in Africa? Why is this a problem? Why are non-communicable diseases something that need our attention? And so I would say that start with a quote from Julio Frank, who's now in Miami, that the creation of knowledge has been central to advancement of health in the 20th century and is critical for improved global health. And this knowledge creation is important because knowledge gets translated into appropriate technologies, be they drugs, diagnosis, prevention, any of the tools. But this knowledge also can be internalized by people and empowers them to in key domains of life. So we can think about actions that empower people to take a hold of their health hand washing, safer sex, eating habits, smoking, things that people can actually do to ensure that they have improved health, optimal health. And these are often public health measures, but people can act upon them. And it's also, this knowledge is the basis for health policy. It can guide decision makers, people who pay for health and welfare activities in their countries, but they need to be convinced of what can and should be done, and good data need to exist in order for them to be convinced. So this knowledge really sort of guides the notion that we have to do research. We have to do good research, and we have to do it in the countries in which we hope to make these impacts. We also can learn through the development and implementation of new tools and technologies. So as you're aware, these novel tools and technologies that can impact on health are also social and economic drivers and disruptors. So the health status of a population relates to security, economic development, social development. To the degree that we can democratize expertise, we can raise the standard and the level of activity, education, social determinants across the board. And one of the key things that I'm going to make the point of in some of the work I'm going to show you in a minute is that we can try to leapfrog technology. Technology allows us to take something, a process, an activity that we have now, and move it beyond where we currently are into something brand new, into something that has an impact more broadly. And we can take the example, at least in Africa, of telephones. You know, landlines were never really very effective in Africa, but now, of course, everybody has a mobile phone. Most people have smartphones, and so that's a good leapfrog from not saying, well, let's make sure that landlines work really well. Let's think of something new that will really have a major impact on all sorts of activities, including health. Of course, it's important for these new tools, technologies, and knowledge to foster innovation, investment in STEM brain drain, of course, because being able to manage the highest level of education, of clinical practice, of training in country, in a place like Africa, will encourage people who are very bright, who are very motivated, to stay there and work. And so again, these implementation of tools and technologies is going to be have value on a lot of different levels, not only to public health, but also to the academic and clinical communities. And many of these tools and technologies are becoming increasingly feasible due to lower costs and accessibility. And you can think of DNA sequencing and immunohistochemistry and things that allow, and that I won't talk about today, but there are plenty of technologies now that are facilitating our ability to do fairly sophisticated work in places that don't have the traditional tools of laboratories and supply chains that have always been a barrier. So another reason to focus on cancer in Africa is we can learn from Africa. So this quote from Pliny the Elder, Africa always brings us something new. And I think that, we often think about, well, how can we improve the situation for health in low and middle income countries? And of course that's true, but we also can learn. We in the United States or in Europe or other high income countries have a lot to learn from places in lower income countries, in particular Africa. Though Africa, in terms of cancer and other diseases, has some unique variation in risk and phenotype, things that we don't necessarily see in other places, but we can learn from. There's unique disease etiologies in natural histories. In cancer in particular, natural history is often disrupted because of screening, because of early treatment and things like that. Since that doesn't happen yet in many parts of Africa, we can learn from a fuller view of the natural history of disease. And that really does inform our understanding of the causes of cancer, progression of cancer, and ultimately treatment of cancer. Of course, because of the African diaspora, the transatlantic slave trade in particular in the United States, we can learn from Africans living in Africa to better inform disease in the African Americans and African descent individuals in Europe and other places. And I think I want to make the point very clearly that diverse data informs disease globally. And let me just give you a couple of examples of why I think this is really important. This is a parochial, non-health related example, but we need data diversity. We need diversity in data to learn about the nature of etiology, the nature of disease. And if we don't have that diverse data, we're going to make mistakes. So here's just a simple example. This is the PULSE algorithm. It's a face depixelizer. So it takes a pixelized picture and it runs it through an algorithm and gets a depixelized face. So you can see the original pixelized pictures on the left. This is, as you can tell, Barack Obama. And when you run it through this PULSE algorithm, Barack Obama becomes the image on the right, who is a white guy, not a Barack Obama, not someone who's got clearly African descent features. And that's because this algorithm was trained on faces from white individuals, from European individuals. And so it didn't know how to get back to a face like Barack Obama's. So again, this is a parochial, simple example, but I think it illustrates the point that if we don't have diverse data, we will not get the right answer to the things that we care about. And that's true not only for the low and middle income country setting, but also for us, for everybody. And just one other example that gives you a sense. And the point, again, I want to make is that by having diverse data, by studying, by creating knowledge in places like Africa, we will benefit everybody, not just those people in those low and middle income countries. So this is an example from Zach Kohani, who is here at Harvard, who studied just genetic misdiagnoses and health disparities in this paper in the New England Journal a few years ago. So what Kohani and his group did was to study hypertrophic cardiomyopathies. So again, irrelevant to cancer really, but these genetic variants were used like we do in cancer to test whether somebody is susceptible to developing a cardiomyopathy. And so you can see that some of the common variants that are used to make treatment interventional decisions are shown on this histogram with the minor allele frequencies. And so you can see in white Americans, some of these variants are very rare. And for many years, people thought, well, these are pathogenic. These are variants that cause hypertrophic cardiomyopathies. And they were treated, they were managed as such. And that was when the data really came from white individuals, European descent individuals. When Kohani and his group looked at Black Americans, African descent individuals, they found that many of these variants, in fact, are really common. They're just polymorphisms. They're common in Black populations, rare in white populations. And what they determined was that these, in fact, weren't pathogenic variants. They're just rare in white populations. So a simple example, but one that says if we don't study diverse populations and have diverse data, we will make mistakes. And the error, of course, is not just here in this case and many others for those underrepresented populations, but also for the majority population, because errors were made in their management and care before we had diverse data. So anyway, I think that this may be preaching to the choir, but we do need diverse data. Diverse data will help those populations that are underserved in globally diverse populations, but they will also help the majority populations. So let me just talk a little bit more about cancer and why we're studying cancer. Why do we care? And I think this is something you're all very well aware of, but there's now a dual burden of disease in places like Africa, of communicable and non-communicable diseases. So you can see these data from the WHO on NCDs. You can see that the communicable diseases in 2010 were very much the majority of deaths, the cause of the majority of deaths. But by 2025, the prediction is that less than half of deaths in Africa will be due to communicable diseases. And as you can see, NCDs go from 20 to 30% of explained deaths. So I think that that's something that is fairly obvious, and it's known to most people. But what's going on? How do we approach this? And I think that The future cancer burden in Africa is also fairly clear. I just give this example from WHO again, that in the next 2 decades, cancer deaths will nearly double in Africa. And this is just due, these figures are just due to demographic changes. They're not due to changes in risk factors like smoking or obesity that I'll talk about in a minute. So this is just the change in demographics, which will lead to about 1.4 million Africans who will die of cancer by 2040. And since about 2015, cancer kills more Africans annually than malaria does worldwide. And as you know, malaria's deaths are decreasing, have been decreasing. And again, I think many of you are aware of this, but this is a good example. Malaria is a good example where taking knowledge, taking relatively simple bed nets and things like that, implemented on a global scale, using knowledge about what works and what doesn't, really can make an impact. Can we do the same thing in cancer? Can we take knowledge and translate it into something that will lessen the curve in increasing cancer deaths? So why do we have this increase in cancer deaths predicted? And this is, again, maybe fairly obvious, but I think it's worth going through. We know that there's an increasing elderly population in Africa. So if you look at the distribution, life expectancy and the population age over 60 in 1950, the dark blue dots are Africa. And so Africa had a lot of, some of the lowest rates or life expectancy, but so did a lot of other countries. And in 2009, as shown on the right-hand slide, Africa remained at the bottom while other countries increased their life expectancies in a lot of different ways. And so this is a picture of how life expectancy can be increased in places that made certain choices, had economic development, had educational development. Whereas Africa remains behind in many ways. But the other thing that's on this plot is that Africans' life expectancy is increasing. So you can see it's gone from the 30s, 40s in 1950 to the 50s, 60s in 2009. And so that is the range in which chronic diseases, and particularly cancer, are starting to be seen. So demographically, these changes are quite important in terms of the risks of cancer in populations. We also know that the change in the burden of risk factors for cancer has been also quite profound. So in the United States, about 30% of US adults are obese, quite a bit of variation there around the country. But we also now are seeing that a large and increasing number of Africans are overweight and obese. And so this is just men over age 30 with a BMI of over 30 from 2010, so a little bit old, but you can see that there are quite a few countries in Africa where there's as high or higher a rate of obesity as in the United States. So again, this is not something that's happening in all countries in Africa, but it certainly is reflecting the changes to lifestyle, to diet, and other things that are really strongly impacting on risk factors associated with cancer. Similarly, smoking, you see in the blue are decreases in smoking prevalence between 2000 and 2020. And you can see in a lot of the higher income countries, a lot of parts of the world, they're blue. There's a decrease in smoking. But you can also see in Africa, there's an increase, small increases in smoking in men, not quite yet so much in women. But we see, as many of you are aware, that smoking rates are increasing. People are picking up smoking in many parts of Africa. The tobacco industry is certainly aggressively marketing smoking in many parts of Africa. So again, it doesn't take a lot of science to understand the impacts of those trends in a place like Africa and the downstream cancer rates and risks that are surely to follow. And we also have a number of limitations. We have, in addition to changes in demographics and changes in risk factors and exposure, we don't have the adequate resources and facilities to address some of these issues. So here's just a couple of examples. One is the percent of the population covered by cancer registries. So in North America, about 83% of the population is covered by a population cancer registry. In Africa, it's about 1%. And I think that even there are efforts to improve this, but even some of the sharing data are really not quite population registries anymore. And in fact, there are a lot of limitations in terms of the amount of data we actually have to understand even what the rates of cancer are in many parts of Africa. And of course, the rates of cancer that you'll find in GlobalCan and other online resources really are modeling very limited data from Africa and extrapolating that into other countries. So we don't really have very good capture or understanding of cancer rates, particularly for specific kinds of cancer. So that makes it, of course, very hard for ministries to plan, to understand what it is they need to do to ensure that they will be able to address cancer now and in the future. Similarly, the clinical resources are quite limited. This slide shows the number of people served by each pathologist in sub-Saharan Africa. So there's about one pathologist for 20,000 people in the United States. And as you can see in this slide in Africa, the best that we're doing in places like South Africa and Botswana are one pathologist for every 200,000 to 500,000 individuals. And you can see in some parts of Africa, there's one pathologist for more than 1 million people in most parts of the continent. So again, the ability to have clinical resources to even diagnose cancer properly, much less treat it and manage it, is very limited. And so you can imagine this is something that has a huge impact on the ability to manage cancer, understanding what cancers are being diagnosed and how, but also just how to treat them and to ensure that their treatment is adequate. In many countries that we work, many of the cancers don't have tissue diagnoses and they don't have staging adequately. So you can imagine that has a huge impact on downstream mortality. Similarly, radiotherapy coverage, you don't have to look too hard to see that the green countries are doing pretty well and the red and maroon countries are not. And those red and maroon countries really are Africa. And so that the radiotherapy coverage, as a core function of treatment for cancer, is really inadequate in most parts of Africa. So again, if we think about mortality and what mortality is going to look like in the future, we're not going to be able to lower mortality rates if we can't treat these cancers properly, adequately, et cetera. So let me just give you an example of prostate cancer. So I've shown you some data that are, not very encouraging, but what do we do? How do we generate knowledge that might be able to start informing our ability to act on some of the things that I just mentioned? And I'll just give you some examples from the work that we're doing, but there's so much that needs to be done, and I'd be glad to take your questions. I'm going to be focusing on the generation of basic knowledge, and because of time limitations, I'm not going to spend a lot of time on developing health systems capacity, care capacity, things like that, but that's also a part of what we need to do. So this is prostate cancer in the world. The green countries are those where the prostate cancer is the leading cause or leading incident cancer. And so you can see that not only in high-income countries, but also across Africa in men, prostate cancer is the leading cancer. And it's an interesting cancer because there are a few known risk factors, age, family history, and race, particularly obesity for aggressive disease. But there are really very few modifiable risk factors. So prostate cancer is unlike many of the other leading cancers where we think that diet, lifestyle, and other exposures are likely to have a major impact on the disease. So we're not really able to prevent cancer in the same way that we probably can in breast or colorectal cancer or some other major leading cancers. And certainly in Africa, cancers like esophageal cancer or stomach cancer or cervical cancer. But we do know that the percent variability due to genetic factors is the highest of almost any cancer that's out there. So, any of the leading cancers. And there are hereditary, high penetrance kind of genetic variants, but we also know that there are a lot of low penetrance variants found by genome-wide association studies. The most recent multi-ethnic prostate GWAS has identified 451 loci, a very large number. So genetics is important. Risk factors are important, but we don't have much to work with. So in our work, we've been trying to think about how to address the genetic causes, the underlying susceptibility to prostate cancer. And again, some of this goes to generation of knowledge. Some of it goes to leapfrogging and understanding, well, if we can't act on prostate cancer through lifestyle interventions or something like that, can we begin to think about what to do in a genetics setting in a place like Africa? So we've developed a network called MADCAP, Men of African Descent and Carcinoma of the Prostate, which is focused across the African continent and has partnerships across North America as well. And so it's a very large network funded by the NCI and other groups. And the reason that we think about genetics, and I know that for many of you studying health in low resource settings, the notion of studying cancer and genetics in a low resource setting where there are so many needs may sound unfamiliar. But I think that genetics is a core element of cancer risk assessment, prevention, therapy, and disease monitoring. There are many guidelines out there. In our philosophy is that Africans and people in low resource settings deserve treatment, prevention activities as much as anybody else on earth, and that we should be able to develop these activities to improve the health of Africans. And again, it goes back very much to the earlier comments that I made, that we're thinking about leapfrogging, we're thinking about developing resources and capacity, many of which will have downstream and broader effects on education, on academics, on medical care in many ways. So let's think a little bit about genetics. So here's some data. This is so diving right into a few data points. This is a polygenic risk score. These are scores that are identified from many loci that are associated with prostate cancer in this case. And so we're asking, well, is there variation in these risk scores across Africa or between Africa and Europe? And so this is just one piece of data that argues that, yes, there are differences in the underlying etiology, genetic etiology of prostate cancer. And much like the face depixelization example that I showed, or the cardiomyopathy example, these kind of data tell us something about the diversity, the variation in data in genetics that is going to be really important for us to understand underlying prostate cancer risk globally. So here I'm just showing the divergence in polygenic risk scores between European and African populations. So in the green histogram there, you're seeing the African distribution of these risk scores. So any part of the distribution going to the right suggests higher levels of risk, and any part of the distribution going to the left of this plot suggests lower levels of risk. And so you can see, first of all, the gray line is Europeans, and the green lines are African descent across the African continent. So the first thing that we're seeing, that many others are seeing, is that Africans have an underlying higher level of risk, genetically speaking, than do Europeans. And that reflects very closely what we know from an incidence standpoint. Prostate cancer incidence is much higher in Blacks, African Americans, than in European Americans in the United States, for example. But we also see that from a global can perspective, Africans have a much higher incidence level than Europeans when good data are available to represent those distributions. So, but even within Africa, there's some variation. So we can learn from underlying genetics in terms of what is causing prostate cancer. We also know that there are important differences in the immune oncologic pathways, DNA damage and repair pathways, radiosensitivity, and actionable mutations. So again, I think it's been very clear that this underlying biology differs by race, by ethnicity, in a lot of different ways that are relevant to treatment, They're relevant to understanding the aggressiveness of prostate cancers. They're relevant to the downstream and the management of prostate cancers. So on the left here, I'm just showing some data that we generated from African Americans and European Americans. So this is not Africans, although we now have a parallel study to generate exactly these data, and we see something quite similar in our African set, that African Americans have a very different immune signature in their prostate tumors than do white European American men. And that there's some suggestion that the immune pathways, immune milieu of African descent tumors in prostate cancers are very much higher immune responsive than in whites. And this is, telling us something about the immunological nature of prostate tumors that do differ by Black and white men. We also see radiation signatures that differ, that there may be a suggestion that DNA damage repair and radiation signatures are different, so that you can imagine that if radiation signatures predict response to radiation therapy, that these tumors may respond differently. So again, not to go into a huge amount of detail about the data, but just to say that we see not only underlying germline differences in susceptibility, but also tumor differences in the biology. And we also see from a paper we published a couple of years ago now that actionable mutations, those that predict whether you're going to be a good candidate for targeted therapies, differ by race. So again, a lot of data that suggests that there are important differences in the underlying molecular signature distribution of Black and white men, and then as we are now generating data in African men. And so you can imagine this is, again, learning from diversity, learning from diverse data, as I mentioned before, but also a lot of implications for how we might want to approach susceptibility, risk stratification, treatment of specific tumors, and even prevention. So if you look on the left-hand side with the immune pathway signatures or radiation signatures, these are the markers that are going to be shed in blood that might be amenable to liquid biopsy, early detection, or disease monitoring through various liquid biopsy approaches. And so there's all sorts of implications. And so you can imagine that these are things that will teach us how to use new tools and technologies better in places like Africa. We also have started to think about what these high risk, high penetrance genes, BRCA1 and BRCA2 just being as an example, where BRCA1 and 2 are associated with very high risk of disease, of breast cancer, ovarian cancer, but also prostate cancer, particularly for BRCA2. And we're seeing, when you start characterizing these mutations, there are some very clearly African origin mutations that are African, that arose in Africa, many that are not African, so many that we can't yet determine. But there are very specific African mutations, and this again helps us to understand the full distribution of the mutational spectrum, but also helps us to understand better risk, particularly in African descent individuals. And you can see just the distribution of these mutations. Here's BRCA2 as an example in Afro-Caribbean, African, and African-American. And it's hard to sort of see, but there are very different frequencies of some of these variants compared to European ancestry individuals. And some of these are really clearly African descent. A couple of those that I've mentioned here are really African descent variants. And so it's really important for us to understand these underlying disease susceptibility distributions in order to characterize risk, to better understand how to use this variation in disease risk assessment. And then now, because BRCA2 and BRCA1 guide treatment through PARP inhibitors, how we can maybe understand better the guidance, the use of therapies in some of these individuals based around their unique genetic patterns. So again, just a few examples of data, but I think this is guiding us toward how we're going to leapfrog the management of prostate and other cancers in 21st century Africa. So if we think about what the activities are, and what kinds of resources need to be developed, we're going to have to identify people who are eligible for genetic testing. We're going to have to develop genetic counseling and genetic testing tools. Genetic counseling in particular, while those facilities and expertise are really well represented in the United States, we can't probably directly translate those techniques and those approaches to an African setting. While some of the principles may be the same, we're going to have to rethink and tailor genetic counseling and possibly genetic testing to the African setting. It requires that we develop prevention and early detection. So obviously, if we're going to do genetic testing, we can't just test people. We have to be able to act on the information. So if the genetic information is not actionable, it isn't really worth doing. So how do we begin to use that information to prevent and detect cancer early in genetically susceptible individuals? We're going to have to be able to diagnose. And as I said before, the pathology resources in Africa are quite limited. So we need to be able to diagnose, and we need to be able to treat and deal with survivorship in those individuals who have been successfully treated. So we will probably, in the genetic counseling, the genetic testing piece has an implications for diagnosis and treatment, as I mentioned, because of high risk, because of targeted therapies that are out there, depending on your genetic profiles in the germline and somatic tissue. So we'll need to develop protocols and practices, risk models, protocols for identifying individuals who are eligible for testing, ascertainment strategies. We have to develop counseling, human subjects, genetic testing, and mutation curation activities. If in prostate cancer, for prevention and early detection, we need to figure out PSA testing. Prostate-specific antigen testing has been kind of a mess in the United States, at least, in terms of who should have the test, what it means, when to act on it. And so we don't necessarily just want to translate that into an African setting. We need to do something that's a little bit more thoughtful based on African data. We need to, as I said, make sure we can get good tissue diagnosis and imaging. Multi-parametric MRI is now a part of the diagnosis of prostate cancer. That needs to be built in. And then obviously a lot of the treatment options, surgery, radiotherapy, and targeted therapies would need to be implemented. And so the resource needs are going to be many, very similar: risk models, genetic counseling and testing, but laboratory medicine, pathology, radiology, surgery, chemotherapy. These are all things that need to be developed. So this is a tall order if we're going to do something that leapfrogs what we currently do in practice of diagnosis, prevention, treatment of prostate cancer and other cancers. We're going to have to develop a lot of various activities. And these activities are not small things. They require large investment. They require ongoing management, of training of individuals who can oversee these activities, investment in reagents and supply chains and things like that. So again, leapfrogging is something that I think is a concept that it's great, and we should be thinking about it, but it's not a trivial undertaking, and it's something that we need to be able to use. We need to be able to make large-scale investments in order for it to be really successful. Large-scale investments in resources and infrastructure, in workforce, and in the clinical health systems that are going to be required to make this all work. So it's a level of investment not unlike cell phones or mobile phones in places like Africa. That was a huge investment. And that is a relatively simple thing if you think about it compared to what we're talking about here. But the concept, I think, remains that if we're going to make these kinds of impacts on health, these are the kinds of investments that need to be made. So the other thing we've begun to do is to think about how we can make these activities happen. As we formed something called the African Oncogenetics Network, which is started by a number of different groups in centers shown on this map, but also with a number of different institutions. And we've begun to pilot this in Rwanda, in Kigali, by understanding how these protocols can be developed, how we can begin to translate the genetic information, provide genetic counseling, and then use that to to take action on prevention, treatment, et cetera. So this is a new network that if anybody's interested in this kind of topic, we hope to be able to build to create the leapfrogging across the continent that I just mentioned. So let me just end by talking a little bit about how we can think about this process. And so this is a framework that we've been using a little bit for a couple of years now to think about if we're going to do something bold, like leapfrog and put cancer genetics into the health systems of Africa, what do we need? So we need inputs. We need to have the stakeholders there provide input to us. And these stakeholders include ministries of health, policymakers, patients, the population, care providers, both medical and family members, that may be involved. So really a clear understanding of what the stakeholders need and what their preferences might be in terms of developing these activities. And we need data. So the data would end up being things like tumor registries, understanding what the burden of disease is, but also baseline data about what are the genetics. Do the genetics differ substantially so that we would need to think about genetic data differently in Africa than we do in a place like the United States, where the fundamentals of genetics may be the same, but the distribution of genetic variants, the relationship of those variants with a risk may be quite different. And again, the stakeholder needs and preferences. We also probably need to think, at least initially, about the priority top cancers. So we're not going to be able to do everything. In our pilots in the African Oncogenetics Network, we're focusing on breast and prostate cancer because those are common cancers for which we have a good foundation about the basic underlying genetics and how to act upon that genetic risk. And then we need to put that into a health ecosystem. So understand the current ecosystem of how health and healthcare are managed by studying health systems, operations, workforce, infrastructure, funding, and understanding how a novel leapfrogging kind of a technology would fit into these, or how this health ecosystem might need to be changed in order to make it integratable. And then, of course, this is all done in the context of other health and social priorities. So obviously, because we want to study the genetics and understand how to leapfrog genomic medicine into an African setting doesn't mean that everything else is going to stop. How do you factor in other health and social priorities while trying to invest? So fortunately, we've been very lucky to have the ministries of health and state in Rwanda, among other groups and health systems, who are motivated to understand this problem and to provide the data and the evidence that might help them to increase the implementation of these kinds of activities. And so that's something that's really critical, is getting the larger health ecosystem involved. And then again, think about the outputs. What are the priority cancer actions? What are we going to do among all the things? What activities, resources are we going to develop? And so we're working with national cancer control plans, community-based advocacy input, health planning ministries. We're talking about all kinds of pathway development to enhance cancer capacity and impact. And so again, I'll just walk through this really quickly. We've started to outline how we might want to develop these activities. So we think about what the underlying drivers of success are, which are funding, operations, personnel, patient engagement, partnerships and collaboration, information management. We're thinking about what the key domains in each of these areas are, as well as the key problems that we anticipate arising as we begin to try to understand how to do this kind of work. And what are our strategic actions? Are there things that we need to be able to focus on that are the next steps, if you will? And there are some very simple things here, a lot of work, but they're straightforward things in terms of analyzing the cancer landscape, doing gap analyses, landscape analyses, things like that, and think about how implementation might ultimately work. And I make the point that these are things we want to think about in advance. We're not starting a genetic testing program and then worrying later about how they might be implemented. We're doing from the start how these things, the whole pattern of genetics and what it might mean, and downstream what the implementation might look like as we think through the problem. And then we have some principles that help us prioritize the resource needs, the time for implementation, including resource needs that are priorities that are buy-in critical. You need to have the ministries of health and state and the health systems need to be on board for this. But there are other things that are quick wins that we can kind of do in the short term. And then in the long term, obviously, create that vision and take it slow and steady. We understand these are not things that are going to happen overnight. These are things that might happen over many years or decades. But there are certainly things that we can imagine with sustained investment and thought and data, we should be able to act upon. And so this is all just the notion that we have been thinking through how one would leapfrog some kind of a novel technology into improved health, improving the systems of care, improving the conditions under which brilliant scientists and clinicians in Africa can really build careers, build infrastructure, and do the things that they might find compelling to take them to England or the United States, but be able to do it in Africa where they can use their brain power and their creativity locally. So again, why are we focusing on Africa? Why are we doing this? Well, I think that in addition to the health benefits, I think that these kinds of activities will foster social and economic progress. I live in Boston, and in Boston, one of the reasons we are so vibrant is that we have strong academic institutions, we have biotech investing, we have just all kinds of things that drive the economy and drive our society. Can these, maybe not recreating a Boston, but can there be activities that create the social and economic progress that enhance healthcare capacity and systems, impact on education, training, and workforce, and ensure the optimal health of Africans? And again, I think that while these activities will have great benefit to Africa and to Africans in a lot of different ways, it will also inform cancer knowledge and practice worldwide. I think that everyone will benefit if we can develop these kinds of activities and the science that brings diverse perspectives, diverse data into the fields. And I think this is not really a luxury. I know it sounds that some of the things that I said, given the many health issues, societal issues in places like Africa, you could say, yeah, but we have other things to worry about, and that's certainly true. But I think that our ability to devote cutting edge scientific knowledge, prevention, treatment, survivorship isn't really a luxury. It's something that everyone deserves to have. And how do we get there? How do we make sure that it can happen? I think that it's a critical need and not an easy thing to accomplish, but something that we should all be giving thought and energy to. So let me just end there and be glad to take any questions you have. This is a picture of one of the recent meetings of our group, of the MADCAP group. And I'm really grateful for you all coming today and for hearing me out. And let me know if you have questions. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much for a really superb presentation, and I think the emphasis you gave during your presentation in terms of the whole concept of leapfrogging, which is not only necessary in all likelihood for the whole area of cancer genetics, but also in a variety of other areas that relate to cancer, whether it be in care and treatment or diagnostics. I mean, there's a need for leapfrogging across the board to be able to get to where we want to get to, to address the looming threat of cancer as we move forward. A couple of questions, and some of the questions that we have received. One of them is this idea of taking into account how tough it is to finance cancer screening and early detection and management and so on in low middle income countries. And there's always a tension between the whole idea of having almost like centers of excellence or locations within a country where the highest level of diagnostics and care and treatment are available versus the whole idea of disseminating the availability of these tools at the primary care level. So would you comment on this tension, and how do you see the stress between excellence, centers of excellence versus more of a decentralized approach?
Yeah, it's a great question, and obviously one that is always going to be a tension, I think, because there will probably always need to be centers of excellence, in the sense that there will have to be experts that are, that have specialized knowledge, specialized equipment, and things like that. We have that in the United States too, where there are tertiary level cancer centers that do things that other cancer centers can't. So I don't think that the two, that the decentralized versus centralized, are mutually exclusive. The question to me is how you get the decentralized primary screening, primary kind of detection of cancer early, and what is the pathway to care for those people that end up needing to go to a Dana-Farber or a Columbia or something like that, because both of those things will need to exist. I think that in terms of screening for cancer, we have a lot of opportunities in front of us that will support the decentralized model. One of them right now, which is early everywhere, but is our liquid biopsies, multi-cancer detection tests that are blood-based tests. And we can imagine that if we can figure out how to make those work, and do them in a way that's inexpensive and maybe demedicalized, meaning can you go to a Walmart or the equivalent in Africa to have some of these tests, and then have a good care pathway that takes that positive information and funnels people who are at high risk or need a further workup into a hub and spoke kind of a centralized model place. I think that would be the kind of thing that we want to do. So not everybody has to have a colonoscopy, even though that might be the gold standard. But if you can get something that's decentralized and then figure out who has to move into something that requires great resources, colonoscopy or mammography or something like that, that would be a model I would think of.
Okay, great, thank you. Another question we have is based on the work that you're doing in Rwanda. What is the prevalence of BRCA amongst, if you have such data from that country, it would be interesting.
Yeah, so there's been a number of studies early on right now that are done in Nigeria, Rwanda, Senegal, and some of our groups. And we don't have a good number for the prevalence of the mutations overall. Those data are being generated. We should have an answer to some of that soon. But what we do know is that in cancer cases, say breast cancer cases that are being genetically tested, the prevalence of BRCA1 or 2 mutations is incredibly high. So first of all, we know that in Africa, there's a predominance of triple negative or ER negative breast tumors. And those are occurring at a much higher rate in Africa than they are in the US, although they're also elevated in African American women. And so that the prevalence of BRCA1 and 2 mutations in African breast cancer cases is much higher than it is in the United States. Some estimates are 25 to 30% of all breast cancer cases have these mutations. So again, very early, but it suggests that a good proportion of these women African women have risk of breast cancer for these mutations, and therefore will require things like PARP inhibitors, which are not widely available, but they would benefit from.
Thank you. Another question is, and this relates to the whole concept of decentralizing to primary care, is that often we kind of pay attention to availability of oncologists or radiotherapy or radiation equipment and so on, and pathologists, but also if we're going to get to where we want to get to, this is going to require a focus more on the mid-level kind of personnel, like pathology technicians, radiology technicians, and so on, and some concrete resources like equipment that works and is maintained and so on. So how do you, again, can you give me a sense in the framework that you shared with us, where do these kinds of efforts sit that are focused on really trying to reach as many people as possible?
Yeah, I think that there's two levels at which we can think about this. One is workforce, as you just suggested. We've been working, for example, on developing histotechnologists who can increase the throughput of pathology diagnosis without necessarily having to have a lot more of the MD specialties, because diversifying the workforce so that there are people who can handle many of the aspects of this work without necessarily having to increase the very highest level is going to be clearly very important. And again, that creating new disciplines, new trained people has social and economic benefits if you can create the need, address the need for these activities. And so that's, I think the workforce is really a very important one, but, we also need to think about the care pathways. I personally believe that that prevention and early detection are going to be even more critical in places like Africa than in high-income countries, because what do we do in the United States? For example, we are developing drugs that are wonderful, nothing against the very high level drugs to treat advanced cancers, but they're very expensive and they require incredible amounts of resources to administer. If we can focus on prevention and early detection, diagnose early that are more easily treatable or don't require the high intensity novel drugs that are being developed for late stage cancers, we should be able to address cancer mortality much more efficiently, particularly if those early detection prevention tools can be demedicalized or be done in a primary care setting, which many of them now are moving in that direction, or even totally outside the medical care system. But the care pathway is really critical, making sure that there's a flow from primary health center to regional hospital to referral cancer center. And making sure that the Rwanda has this actually, which is a great model. Make sure that there's a pathway for anyone, no matter where they're diagnosed or where they're screened, to get into the proper care that they need.
Great, thank you. And maybe a quick question and a quick response is, this is someone who is in the digital health startup world, is asking, what are the best approaches to gather the kind of data that you have been talking about, and where can these data be housed to inform the research? A quick response, please.
Yeah, there's a lot of cloud-based activities right now, developing common interoperability standards across different centers so that there's plenty of opportunity for the crosstalk between registries, hospital databases, EMRs, things like that, and using novel machine learning AI technologies. So I think there's a lot. This is going to be a central way in order for us to address the knowledge gap.
Thank you. Very exciting, and something certainly to look forward to as we move forward. Well, thank you very much, Dr. Rebbeck, for a superb presentation today of great interest to our audience here. And I just want to let everyone know that we have the upcoming grand rounds. ICAP grand rounds will be focused on improving improving epidemic readiness, not HIV, overall epidemic readiness. So please join us on July 18th. For the ICAP grand rounds. And thank you again for joining us today. And as I mentioned earlier, the slides and the presentation will be uploaded on the ICAP website shortly. Thank you and have a good day.